Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our presentation today, Interview Success Skills, the science behind why what you say and how you say it makes a difference, presented by Dr. Valerie Friedland, Professor of Sociolinguistics and Director of Graduate Studies at the University of Nevada in Reno. My name is Mara. I'm the Content Manager at Ivy Exec, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items for our audience. First of all of our attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions to our presenter, which you can do using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. You can ask questions at any point, and we'll address them all at the end. Additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. And now I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Valerie Friedland. Dr. Friedland is a professor of sociolinguistics and director of graduate studies at the University of Nevada in Reno. An expert on the relationship between language and society, her work has appeared in numerous academic journals, and she is co-author of the book Sociophonetics, coming soon from Cambridge University Press. Her language blog, Language in the Wild, is featured on Psychology Today, and her lecture series, Language and Society, is featured on The Great Courses. She is also working on her first book for a popular audience, I Hate When You Say That, coming out with Viking Penguin. She regularly appears on podcasts and news programs such as The Elegant Warrior, The Mentor Project, The Wave, Walk My Mind, CBS News, and Newsies The Why. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Valerie. It's all yours. Take it away.
Thanks, Mara. Well, I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about how we should talk when we're in an interview. We all have these ideas of what we should be like when we go into interview, especially for high-level management positions. A lot of times we want to look professional, and obviously we need to have the requisite skill set for the position, and this sort of bolsters our abilities in getting that job. But we also want to have ambiance of confidence and intelligence and competence. We want to be socially savvy and friendly and warm and a team builder. So how do we project those kinds of qualities? A lot has to do with your speech. We don't tend to think of how we speak. We tend to think more of what we say as being important. But a lot of research actually suggests that how you say what you say is just as important as what you're saying. In fact, evidence suggests that when you go in for an interview, they don't actually remember what you say that well, but they will remember whether you are a culture fit. And a lot of what makes you a culture fit is how you talk. So we basically want to hire employees that obviously have the skill set, but also that look and talk the part. So today I'll talk to you a little bit about how we can do that. So since we need to know a little bit about our linguistic style, I thought today we'd start with unpacking what it means to have a linguistic style. So what is linguistic style? How do we get one? And the most important thing is what kind of linguistic style is good for when we're going on a job interview. And then after we land that interview, when we're in the workplace. Obviously, power and workplace settings is often associated, and especially in high-level positions. So we'll talk a lot today about what it means to have powerful versus powerless speech. And this has been an area of great research. So when we look at that research, we'll look at the overall takeaway of your style in general, but we also, in order to help you really hone your style, look at the specific linguistic features that can be most damaging or most helpful in landing that plum job. So finally, we'll come down to some tips and takeaways that you can take away with you to help refine your linguistic style. But first, let's talk about the idea of linguistic style itself, because we often think about style in terms of having a personal style, maybe the way we dress or how we self-present, but we don't think of linguistic style very often. But we all have some kind of verbal presentation tendencies that we lean on. We just might not be that aware of which ones they are. So I thought I'd put up a couple examples on the screen there, and I want you to take a look at those two and compare them. I want you to think about, what do you see that's different? note the features that you see, the specific features, because today we're going to learn how to pull out those very specific features rather than a more holistic approach to just change your style in general. So look at those two sentences and think, okay, what's different between them? And then what is the impression of the speaker or the takeaway I would get away with when I read those or when I heard those? So just take a minute and look at them. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at them. So they're both similar in terms of their semantic content. And what I mean by that is the meaning of those sentences are essentially identical. The truth of what they say about the world or what they're propositioning about the world is both the same in both sentences. But they're quite different in how they're structured. If you look at the first one, well, I think that looking to outreach in Asia would perhaps be beneficial to the company's growth. You see that it talks about outreach to Asia, but it pulls out different ways of phrasing it. So it has a discourse marker, well, at the very beginning, something we all use regularly in our speech. And then it has hedges, I think, and perhaps, that are inside the sentence itself. If you look at the second, you don't have any of those mitigating tendencies. You instead have a more direct or bald sentence where it just has an which is a hesitation marker inside of it. So those are constructed in quite different ways, even if they essentially say the same thing. And the reason you would construct them differently is to have a different style in your speaking presentation. And we learn this style is just part of who we are growing up. But if you look at the first sentence with the hedges and the discourse markers, you see that it's a less direct, more mitigated, more polite type of speech. So the impression of the speaker might be that they're sensitive to the listener. The other sentence really has none of that mitigation, so it's called a bald sentence or a direct sentence. And it does have a hesitation marker, which is usually speaker-centered. So it is about the speaker's cognitive processing rather than they're looking to the listener. So two very different types of speakers emerge from those different styles. Now, neither is a good style or a bad style. They're just different styles. But when you're going into an interview, it's really important to know how you might want to moderate your style to make a better impression. So we're going to break down some of that research today. All right, a good question, of course, before we get into actually unpacking that research is, how do we get our style? What makes our style? Well, our style is highly dependent on who we are socially. And I'm not talking about just if we're happy people or sad people, or if we're good at a party, although those are great aspects of style as well. But who we are in terms of social factors. So if we're male or female makes a big difference in our style. If we're younger or older, the types of positions that we hold, and not just positions currently, but how we got there. So how we started out. And also where we grew up, either in region or nation, can make a big difference. So I might have a different culture of politeness if I'm from a different country than a country where politeness is not so valued. All of those will impact my linguistic style. Now, of course, there's also some more just casual lifestyle type influences on style. So I might just be a more laid back person, and that will also influence my style. Most of us, when we talk in our everyday context, are talking to people we get along with, we know well, we're comfortable with, in a situation called homophily. Now, homophily is the idea that birds of a feather flock together. So you tend to talk to people whose linguistic style most matches yours. When that happens, we're pretty comfortable that how we say things will be interpreted the way we intend them, because that's the way they talk as well. But when we move into a less familiar context, as we do when we go into a job interview or enter a workplace in a new corporate culture, we can't be quite as certain that our linguistic style will be construed as we intend it. Another big factor, and one that's going to be very important to our discussions today, is relative status. So relative status, meaning whether I'm in a one up or one down position, or if I have a higher position than someone else, just from even an economic standpoint, from a workplace standpoint, from just being a man versus a woman, all of those things that have to do with status will affect not only our style, but also how our style is construed. So it's really dependent on a lot of different factors in a context that are important to consider. So now let's switch to the kinds of styles that are important when we go into a job interview or we're in any workplace setting. This is the powerful versus powerless speech styles. And those are big terms for interesting concept of how we alter our speech to get different types of work done. So over the years, a lot of attention has been focused on identifying what features constitute a powerful speech style versus a powerless speech style. So a lot of the types of features that have been studied have tended to be things that we might think impact that. And those are things like hesitation. So those are the that we talk about, or hedges, which we had an example of earlier, or intensifiers, discourse markers, different types of polite forms, and even things like higher voice pitch. I'll unpack a little more what all those mean as we go through. But in general, there are a lot of different components that can be considered part of what constitute either a powerful or a powerless speech style. Now, when you use fewer of those features, it is construed as a more powerful style. So it's really not that there are features that you use that make you powerful, but it's instead that you're not using the features that make you seem powerless. So I put up some examples on the PowerPoint that show you a mitigated versus an unmitigated directive. So in the first one, it's, would you mind shutting the window, please? There you can see there's politeness features. It's in a question form. It's a lot more polite. The other one is simply shut the window. And it's very unmitigated, it's bald. So obviously there's a difference in the level of politeness, but there's also a difference in the level of power. You can only use the last one, shut the window, when you know you have enough power or influence in a setting that this will actually get the work done. If you're not absolutely sure that you have that kind of status, you have to mitigate what you say in order to get things done. And this is why, as we'll see, relative status plays a key role in determining the type of style you can adopt, because it's not as straightforward as using a powerful style when you want to get things done and using a powerless one. Oops, hold on, I'm having a little PowerPoint here. Let's see if this can get it to go. Okay, there we go. All right, so, oops, let me go back one. Well, let's unpack what it means to have a powerful speech style. Now, it's really important that whenever I talk about these speech features and about powerfulness or powerlessness, that we're not thinking that it has anything to do with abilities or knowledge. So as a linguist, I look at language descriptively rather than prescriptively. Prescriptive norms, so things like don't end a sentence with a preposition or don't dangle your modifiers, are really just social preferences. There's nothing inherent in a dangling modifier that's bad. It's all about style and preferred style. So the reason we say things like don't end a sentence with a preposition is because in Western culture, we put a primary importance on written documents and written styles. Now, obviously, oral speech preceded written forms for quite a long time. And if you look back into the history of Old English, you find that we didn't really have these kinds of standards and norms at that time. There wasn't a lot of prescriptive value in speech because most of it was oral. It's only in about the 18th century that this importance of having things in standards and in usage guides became important. And this is because it was an outgrowth of the rise of literacy and the importance of the written word and documentation. So all of these things are just about styles that are preferred, not actually about knowledge or abilities. And from a linguistic perspective, there's no such thing as a good feature or a bad feature. None of these are speech errors. All of them are just differences in how we construct linguistic sentences. So a speech error would be something like having a false start or having maybe a word that doesn't work out. You can't remember it. Those are errors. But just using a hedge or not using a hedge is just a matter of style. So I just want to preface this with none of these are bad. They're just different in how they work for you. A great deal of research has looked at how they're working and how they impact the way that we consider and perceive speakers, and how this has real world impacts, such as whether people are found guilty in courtroom settings, whether people are promoted in boardroom settings, and the lives that people have at home in terms of the styles that they use. So the first type of research we did on powerful and powerless speech emerged out of the 1970s, when a lot of these powerless features were associated with women's talk. There was a seminal book published in 1975 by Robin Lakoff that talked about many of the features we'll talk about today, and said that they were common among women and less among men, and that they made women be perceived as less certain or sure. Now, the problem with this book was there was no real research behind it. It was all anecdotal. And so it launched an explosion of research subsequent. And primarily in the 1980s, this research looked at settings where there was a clear power hierarchy. And one of the good places to find that kind of hierarchy is, of course, a courtroom, because you have a very clear structuring of who has the most power in that setting and who has the least. So obviously you start with the judge with the most power, and then you have the attorneys, the expert witnesses, and then the lay people that are just there as witnesses or defendants if they're having a very bad day. So what we found when we looked at the distribution of a number of features, and usually they were measured as composite features, so they didn't tease out which ones were actually contributing to the effects mostly. And we'll talk more about that because that's obviously important if you want to manipulate your speech. But what they found was the use of powerful or powerless language really affected the way that people were construed in the courtroom. The more powerful features that were used, the more certain, credible, and confident, and even trustworthy the people speaking. Now, of course, this tended to be the judges, the lawyers, the expert witnesses, because they were in positions of status and therefore had more powerful speech features at their command because of the position and the effects they knew it would have. Those using the powerless language features, on the other hand, were rated as not credible and not trustworthy, and oddly enough, not very attractive. Now, if you are on trial for something, clearly being not credible or trustworthy simply on the powerless language features you choose can be problematic. So obviously this is something that we wanted to investigate more. And so it was looked at in other contexts by communication research. So this was in the late 80s and the 90s and now the 2000s, where the types of research they did in the courtroom expanded into other contexts. And obviously any context that has a power differential is a good place to look for this. And a perfect one with power and status is interview context. So a lot of this communication research focused on looking at how these features were used in mock interview settings. And we found much the same thing as they did in the courtroom. Using a more powerful style overall led to you giving a more favorable impression on those that were evaluating you in an interview context. We also found that your persuasiveness, if you used a less powerful style, was affected. And this is probably because of the effect of powerless features on credibility and confidence ratings. So if you're not credible and and people are not confident in you, then you'll probably be less persuasive in your message. Of course, all this comes down to the fact that having that powerless style and using those features can actually negatively affect whether you're recommended for hiring. And so this is something we obviously want to be aware of when we're going into a job interview setting. However, of course, it's never that simple that you can just go and say, okay, I'll adopt powerful speech features because that's obviously going to get me where I want to be. But it may not, because it's never that straightforward when we talk about speech, because it's not just whether we have power or not in our own minds, it's whether we have power or not in the perceptions of others. And our speech style and the ones that we should adopt to make the best impression are going to be tied to others' perception of our expertise and our status in a specific context. So when you are in a higher status position, you're going to be expected to use more powerful speech features. But when you're in a low status position, such as a job interview, even if you have expertise, you will be expected to use more powerless speech features. Because if it's adopted without it being congruent with your position, it actually hinders the way that people perceive you. Because we have expectations for the types of speech features we expect in certain relative roles and certain relative contexts. If you violate those expectations, then that often affects us in terms of negative perception of performance. So what we see here is there's a very thin line between using features that sort of bring to mind confidence and knowledgeableness and certainty, and those that make you seem appropriately deferential and understanding of the positions relative to others that you're in. So we have to mitigate our powerful speech features with our positions at the time. And of course, this is where it gets a little tricky. So that's what we'll talk about today. So in order to do this and understand how we might want to use our verbal habits in ways that make us appear stronger in job interview contexts or even in life itself, we need to look at how specific features might be working to help or hinder us in those contexts. So I'll go through some of the top ones here. And maybe you have thought about these before in terms of, okay, yeah, I don't like these or I like these, but probably you're not that aware of what you actually use. So a lot of times we have a perception of our own speech that is more holistic. So we might say, oh, I need to be more professional, and you might get more formal. So you might use sort of more impressive vocabulary, or you might add more ing endings to your verbs. But there are a lot of other little things we might not be aware of that we do that will contribute to the perception that you give off. One of the biggies is hedges. And we had an example of hedges in one of those sample sentences I put up on the screen at the very beginning. Hedges are essentially features that mitigate the force of what you're trying to say. They soften it. Common hedges that we use in daily conversations are things like I think, I feel, I imagine, I guess, or the small pieces that we stick into sentences like maybe, sort of, kind of, perhaps. I've put 2 examples up there on your screen. I think that strategy makes sense is one example, or maybe shifting operations makes sense. You can see that both of those serve to kind of soften the force of what is said. Now, it's important to note that hedges are not themselves negative. They actually do a lot of good work for us. For one, they often tell our listener how certain we are of what we say. And that's in cases like, oh, I think it might rain tomorrow. If you say that to someone and their choice of bringing an umbrella is weighing on you, you probably want to let them know if you're not absolutely sure. So when you say something like, I think it might rain tomorrow, that communicates to your listener that, yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm not a meteorologist, but I've kind of gotten that sense from something I heard, or the way the clouds look, or whatever it feeds your knowledge about rain, that it might happen. So that's about certainty. That's whether an epistemic position you have, whether or not you think 100% is going to happen, or you have to mitigate that amount. But that is not the only work hedges do. Sometimes we actually use them for polite speech because we're reducing what's called the face threat of making a strong assertion. Now, face is something that we have positive face and negative face. My positive face is my need to be liked and have people like me. And so I mitigate my speech to do things that will make me seem friendly and open and warm. We also have negative face. And negative face is the fact that we're aware when we're talking to other people that we can impose on them or we can offend them. And so we consider when we're constructing our sentences how what we say might affect their negative face. So if I'm making a very strong assertion and say, you are the one in charge of operations and where you had operations wasn't working, if I just tell you shift operations, it's not working, that is a pretty bald, unmitigated, and potentially face-threatening act. And particularly if I'm in a sensitive position of status, where maybe we're on equal status, or you're in a higher status position, or you're connected to someone that might be in a higher status position to me, I might not want to say something in such a bald way that it doesn't leave me any kind of wiggle room in changing my position if I find out that you're not also in agreement with it. So it is a way of softening the force and not being uncertain. But the problem is, because of the way that we think of hedges as tied to certainty, like I think it might rain tomorrow, we often see all uses of hedges as reflecting on the certainty of the speaker, right? So while they're primary to polite speech and they're also really important with certainty, it can also cause us some problems in terms of how confusion in how we should be interpreted. They do some good work for us from a cognitive perspective. In a study in cognitive psychology, they found that when you use hedges in front of information you're uncertain about, so for example, numbers or dates, it actually serves as a pragmatic cue to the listener for them to remember the amount and that you're uncertain about it. So it actually does a lot for your memory. So they're not bad, but unfortunately, they're not really perceived very well. So even though they have some clear benefits, in general, they're really bad in terms of how you're affected on confidence and certainty scales. So if you look at the research on hedges, you see that they are in general less favorable in the perceptions that they have. Not only in terms of how the speakers are perceived, because sometimes it's just, okay, well, I can understand what they're saying, but I didn't really like the way they delivered it. Unfortunately, hedges have a triple impact. Not only do they affect how you like or dislike the speaker, but also how you liked or disliked their message and the ideas contained in that message, which is obviously not something in a workplace environment that's going to be very handy. We also find that they affect how authoritative you were perceived, how trustworthy you were perceived, and how sociable you were perceived. When you had a message with lower hedges, so this was in a study where they had the same message with either a high hedge rate or a low hedge rate, what they found was when they used fewer hedges in the message was rated as more authoritative and more trustworthy than those that were delivered with higher hedge use. And in fact, in a retrospective study of all the powerless speech features that had been studied, research suggested that using a lot of these hedges has the most significant effect on perception, and not in a good way. So clearly something you might want to avoid. But we have to look at the flip side. And as I said, things are never quite so simple. And don't worry, we're going to distill it down to see what's the takeaway in terms of looking at the good and the bad of all these features. But what we find is when you look at how using more hedges is rated badly on authoritative scales, the flip side is it makes you more sociable. And we often find there is this kind of opposition between being competent and confident and being friendly and likable. And hedges seem to also have that negotiation in them. We also find that it's not straightforward with both being in power and using hedges and being in less powerful positions and using hedges. Again, like we talked about earlier with relative status, when you had a position that was lower status, but even potentially expert, which would be something like a job interviewee, where you might have the expertise they need, but just by virtue of that context, even if later on you'll be in a powerful position, it puts you in a lower status, one down position. You were viewed as more likable when you used hedges, and you were also more influential when you used hedges than when you used a powerful speech style. And here's where we get into something that is a bit of a double bind, because gender also plays a big role in how we perceive hedges. Women are thought of as using more hedges overall, and in fact, studies do support that to some degree this is true. And so when women use a lot of hedges, because this matches our social expectations for them, it actually improves how they're viewed on dynamism and attractiveness scales, which is not an effect that we find for men. So it is more negative for men to use hedges than for women to use hedges, part of our social and normative expectations that we have. So now we have all this confusing advice. What do we do for the takeaway? Well, in general, while hedges do have some beneficial effects, for example, they help you with establishing sociability and friendliness, they overall detract from what you're trying to say, and they give off this impression that you're more uncertain and less confident, which are probably not things that you want to have going out there when you're doing a job interview. So it seems that using few hedges overall are better. And this is especially true for men. It won't hurt a woman to decrease her hedge use some, but it will really help a man to decrease his. So what could we do in terms of adding some to spice up our talk to make us likable and sociable, but also not communicate that we're really uncertain and not confident? Well, try to focus on using hedges where degree of certainty is what you're intending. So use them when they're authentically there to mitigate the degree of assertion that you want to make. Something like, oh, I think it was 8 or 9 years ago. When you're not absolutely sure, that's not going to hurt that you're truthful in not knowing for sure how long ago it is. But in the second example, you can see up there, oh, I think my skill set shows this. Well, obviously you should know your skill set. So this is probably not intended to be a degree of certainty hedge. It's probably intended to be a softening face acknowledging hedge. But because of our association with, I think, with degree of certainty, this makes you seem uncertain about your skill set. So you can see there's a very subtle difference between where you should use them. So try to focus on using them in the first context and not the second. All right, so let's move on to another speech feature. And this is, of course, one we all love to hate: pause fillers or hesitations. So pause fillers are things like and 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 are actually something that all languages have. And in fact, all Germanic derived languages, which English are, have the same two pause fillers, ironically enough, and which suggests they have been very well used and well needed through time. So this begs the question of why we and at all. Well, they're actually quite fascinating in terms of how they developed and also why we need them. They seem to be markers of deep involvement in cognitive processing. So for example, when we're talking to less familiar people, so we don't know them as well or what to expect or their expectations of us, or we're talking about less familiar topics, or we're developing abstract ideas, these are all going to increase the number of pause fillers that we use. The other area that seems to increase our pause filler use is when we're constructing our sentences in particular ways. When we're using more complex linguistic structures, and this would be things like embedding clauses in other clauses or sentences with multiple sentences embedded in them. Or when we're searching for less widely used words, so unfamiliar words, or words that perhaps are job specific, so you don't use them as often. All of this increases the numbers of and us we use. Now, these, of course, are all things in a formal interview that you're experiencing. Not only less familiar speakers, you're probably developing more abstract ideas, and we all try to use big words when we're in interviews. So all of these things will actually increase your tendency to and when you're in contexts that make you nervous or are less familiar or have that kind of formal interview context. So I put up on the screen a couple examples of the types of sentences that would increase and versus those that wouldn't. So in the first example, you can see that it's actually a lot of clauses embedded in other clauses, and it's simply a cognitive processing issue there. When we're embedding clauses syntactically, at every syntactic structure turn point, which means every time a new syntactic structure is opened, and that's a very linguistic way of saying a lot of words put together at once, it actually increases the tendency to have an or before that syntactic structure. In the second one, you only have one subject and one predicate. There's no embedding, and therefore you're less likely to have an or a. So the shorter and simpler your sentences are, the fewer ums and uhs you'll tend to find. What's really interesting about and is they're actually incredibly useful from a listener standpoint, even if they're not so useful from a speaker standpoint in terms of how you're perceived. We think of them as bad things and mistakes or speech errors, but actually psycholinguistically, they really help the listener remember what you say. So I put up on the screen a few of the studies, and there's actually a lot of studies on this, that show how they help us. When we look at EEG studies of people that are listening to information, what we find is that when we precede what we say to them with a filled pause, they show greater neural response. And this is suggested to show an enhanced memory. We also find that response rate time is lessened when we precede a word or an unfamiliar shape with an or a. So that means we're better at word identification and recognizing shapes because of the and a. And finally, when we tell stories to listeners and we actually interject those stories with filled pauses, either or we find they do better in remembering the story that we told them than when it was not injected with those filled pauses. Now, you might think, well, that's simply because there's some time that's bought when you say and it lets the listener sort of process what you're saying a little more. But we actually see that when we do the same experiment with either silent pauses equivalent to the length of a filled pause or even a cough equivalent to the exact length of the filled pause, we do not see that kind of effect. So it's clearly actually related to the filled pause. So the takeaway here is that they actually improve recall of what you're saying. So it's not a bad thing for a little marker. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean we like them. When we hear them, we still think of them as speech errors, despite the fact that they obviously have processing benefits. In a natural language processing experiment that looked at mock interview text and examined the types of features that correlated with improved or negative ratings of job applicants, what we find is when they had fewer pauses, when those applicants were rated higher. So obviously that was a direct impact, a direct correlation between use of number of pause fillers and how people were related. We also find other research that suggests that when you use a lot of those fillers, they decrease your ratings on a number of scales of things that you would definitely not want to have negative associations with for a job interview. And these are things like how authoritative you were, how competent you were, how employable you were, and your overall character. Obviously, these are a lot of personality traits to judge on this, just the basis of a little and but we actually do find that people do it. Now, we also find, though, that pauses in general affect the way that listeners are rated. And when you used a filled pause instead of simply a silent pause, it actually affects the way that people think of your general personality as being more anxious. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't use filled pauses at all, because when you're going to pause anyway, they seem to make you seem less anxious. So what's the takeaway of all this information? Well, they actually seem to help us remember what people say. So this isn't a bad thing in a job interview, because if it helps processing, then maybe people are listening to you a little more. But they are detrimental to how you're perceived. And these are important dimensions in a job interview that you don't want to have downgraded. So probably try to lessen the numbers of ones you use. However, if you are going to pause anyway, so if you're not sure what you are saying and you need some planning time, go ahead and use an and It would be more awkward to not use them because you come across as more anxious. Here's another part where gender plays a role. Now, when we look at sociolinguistic research on the distribution of filled pauses by age, and gender, and by education level, we actually find there is a difference in who uses them. Men use more filled pause overall than women, to quite a great degree, particularly when is concerned. So the difference in umming and uhing between men and women is that men use more and women use about the same as men. So when women use a lot of and this is more marked or noticeable than men use them, because we have an expectation of umming and uhing with men that may be absent for women. So this is one of those cases where women using more of them may be more downgraded. We also find that older speakers use more and than younger speakers. So again, younger speakers umming and uhing may be judged to be less competent and less intelligent than older speakers using them. And it's probably because younger speakers come across as less confident and certain overall anyway. And so when we hear them using markers that seem to us to indicate hesitation, we might downgrade them more. All right, so let's move to something that actually is a little more positive, and that's intensifiers. Now, most of us use these, and we may not know what they're called from a linguistic standpoint, but essentially they're adverbial modifiers that amp up or boost the impact of what we're trying to say. And usually we use this with either verbal intensity or adjectival intensity. So we're putting them before a verb or before an adjective. And I put up some examples up there of some pretty common ones. And that's something like, I'm so excited about this company, or I'm really, really enthusiastic about this opportunity. Common intensifiers that we use in everyday speech are things like so, very, totally, completely, absolutely, really, the all-time favorite, literally, and incredibly. So there are a lot of intensifiers actually, but these are some of the most common. In fact, the most common intensifier in speech is very, followed quickly by really. And this depends a little bit on nationality. So British speakers tend to lean on very a lot more than American speakers, who lean more on really. But we also use a lot of these other ones, which are usually derived from adverbs of manner. And they usually express some sort of maximal or really high level of something. And so often they're called boosters. So this can't be bad, right? You want to tell people how excited you are. But the problem is we tend to overuse them. And we also are repetitious in our use of them. And so we hear a lot of complaints about the overuse of intensifiers. So saying something like, it was so, so, so good, or it's very, very amazing. And one of the complaints is that when you use so many intensifiers, there's sort of an easy way out of using more descriptive words. Now, from a linguistic standpoint, I actually don't think this is true, because the only reason we think they're less descriptive is because perhaps they're more common. And there's nothing lazy about using common words. But it is true that there are other adjectives that would express the intent without using quite so many intensifiers. Another problem is that some intensifiers stand out more than others. So I mentioned literally as one, and literally is probably the most despised newer intensifier that we have around. And there are certainly a lot of people that use it, but there are also a lot of people that hate it. So it's one that you need to be careful about. Other intensifiers that can get you into trouble are things like totally and so, and even sometimes really in casual speech, because they have a strong association with youth culture, which isn't always in a job interview what you want to be associated with. The interesting thing is, despite the fact that we hear a lot of complaints about intensifier use, they're actually not viewed that negatively when we look at how they're rated in comparison to other powerless speech features. So actually they work to enhance perceptions rather than hurt them. And so they seem to be more similar to powerful speechers than powerless ones. But this seems to only be the case when they're not used with a lot of other powerless speech features. So while they do actually increase evaluations of both authoritativeness and confidence, and crucially sociability, which many features don't have both those sides of the coin, If you use them with powerless features, it actually decreases how they're taken in that way. So you have to be careful when you use them and use them sparingly, but they do overall enhance perceptions of being certain and being in control. And these are certainly things that you want to put across in a job interview context. So what's the takeaway here with intensifiers? Well, they don't seem to be bad things as long as you're not using them too much with other powerless features like hedges and hesitation markers, which, as we've seen, do seem to be taken as negative. We also find that some boosters are very youth culture oriented, and things like so or totally. So in a professional setting, it probably is not advantageous to use those too much, and literally is probably one you want to stay away from, just because people have very strong feelings on that matter. You want to make sure you don't overuse them. So don't be repetitious in using them. So, very, very, really, really. Use them once, use them sparingly. And you might also want to make sure you're not trading them for places where you could use more descriptive terms to give a better sense of who you are. And so an example of this would be something like, oh yes, I'm very experienced, versus I have a lot of expertise in X, Y, and Z, where that actually gives you the opportunity to discuss where your expertise is. So in that sense, you actually could be more descriptive and probably give a more specific idea of where your strengths lie. So now let's move to our last category of things that we might want to do to enhance our speech, and that's discourse marking. We all use discourse markers. It's actually a way that we do a lot of conversational cohesion, that we let people, our listeners, know where to look in our speech for important information, and it also provides a lot of interrelational context for speakers and checks for listenership. So I put up some examples up there. I want you to take a look at those sentences for a minute and get a sense of the differences between them. So when you're looking at those two sentences, they involve different discourse markers. In the first, it's you know, in the second, it's well. And think to yourself for a minute of what work those are doing. Why are they in there? All right, so what you might have noticed is when you say you know, it's actually tuned to your listener. So it's listener focused, and it's checking for listenership, or sort of just making sure that they're around and agree with you. The second one, well, is really more attended to what was said before. So if I said something like, what is your opinion on this? You might say, well, looking to outreach. So it's tying what you're saying to the previous discourse. So as we can see, discourse markers do a lot of different jobs, and some are very focused on attention, getting the attention of the listener, and others are more focused on conversational cohesion. And another thing about discourse markers, in addition to doing a lot of different types of work, there's also some that are more colloquial than others. So actually, well, by the way, so all of those are pretty much more standard and formal compared to things like you know and like, which have a more colloquial, sometimes even Valley Girl association. So what do we want to be aware of when we're using discourse markers? Because obviously there's a lot of them, and we can't really have conversations without them. We have to provide some sort of conversational cohesion, and we also do want to involve our listeners in our conversation. So we do often provide that kind of listenership check. Well, what we find is, while using some of them might be okay, if we overuse them, they seem to make us seem less confident and more uncertain about what we're saying. They also can affect how we're perceived on professional credibility scales. And like in particular is probably the worst thing you can say in a job interview setting, because of its connotations of youthfulness, of Valley Girl speak, and of professionalism. So when you look at like use in interviews, and surprisingly, there is actually quite a high level of like use in interviews, we find that while they do occur, they tend to occur mostly when people let their guard down and are having more casual aspects of that interview come forth. So we find that they correlate not to the parts where you're answering about your skill set or what you're going to do for the company, but when you're talking about your family or things you like to do, or more casual conversation, once a little more of a friendly conversation starts to come out. So you need to be aware of the fact that sometimes our discourse markers will shift depending on the type of conversation we're having. And this is where you most want to be aware of not using like. We also find that they can be annoying if you use too many. And some cognitive psychologists looked at the processing efforts that it seemed to require when speakers used a lot of you know and I mean. And I put a quote up there because it shows that actually they can backfire on you. So while using them can be good for conversational cohesion and for listenership, they actually require more work in processing on the part of your listener, which then can aggravate them if you use it too often. So definitely something you want to be aware of when you're constructing your speech. But on the other hand, we also don't want to not use them, because when we look at what makes an effective speaker, we find that they overall do use discourse markers, though they use them in a measured degree. But the most effective speakers were those that use discourse markers, because if we don't have them in our speech at all, we come across as unnatural and robotic. And of course, we don't want to do that in a job interview. Some cognitive psychologists looked at those who use discourse markers more than others, and they had them take personality tests, or they actually had a wide range of people take personality tests. And what they found was those that used more discourse markers tended to be the more conscientious people. And they posited that they did that because using discourse markers shows conversational considerateness. In other words, it's a collaborative building of conversation, which is why we like them. So what we find is that they actually might be beneficial because they allow us to help encourage others to make inferences about what we say, and they invite them to collaborate in our discourse. But we just want to also be wary of which ones we use. So what's the takeaway here? Well, using them in isolation is not a bad thing because they enhance the natural flow of conversation. But you want to use ones that are associated with more formal use. So by the way, so, things like that. I mean, even is okay, but like and you know tend to be construed negatively, and especially where they occur can affect how negative they are taken. So you know at the beginning of or end is not too bad, but if you insert it in the middle of a sentence, for example, it's been shown to really be more of a distraction. So use them in moderation, but be careful because speakers are usually not very aware of how many they actually use. And the study showed that people generally underestimate the extent to which they use discourse markers and which ones in their speech. And this leads us to how to go about honing your linguistic style for the big interview. So now you've had a lot of information about a bunch of different studies and positives and negatives and some takeaways. But how do you actually take those ideas and put them to work in your own speech? Well, first you have to know what you lean on. You have to be a self-aware speaker and get a sense of your own linguistic style. But how to do this? Well, you can't really do this if you haven't self-analyzed. So I'm going to give you a little homework to do some self-analysis. And in this type of self-analysis, you don't want to set it up in an interview context. Instead, what you want to do is make sure you have a natural conversation, because in our natural, spontaneous speech, we're going to lean on the types of markers we're going to use most readily when we're nervous or uncertain, and that will tell us really what we do. We're all going to shift to a more formal style when we're in interview context, so we'll probably reduce the number of those that we use, but to get a really good sense of your linguistic style, have a natural, spontaneous conversation. Zoom is great for this because it has a recording function. So you could just set up a Zoom call with a friend and have a conversation with them that's fairly natural. So this, you might want to go ahead and talk for about 10 minutes till you get over the fact that you're recording it, and then take about the middle 10 or 15 minutes of your conversation and transcribe what you said. Now that means verbatim. Take note of what you said. You don't want to skip over things. Every little hesitation, every filler you use, the length of every pause, note those things. And then take a look at what you're doing in your speech when you've transcribed it, because we often get a gist of what we say when we think about our style, but we don't really know what we're doing until we actually have analyzed our speech, and it often will shock you what you actually use. So once you have done this, you can see the patterns that you fall into. So for example, if you're pausing, where are you pausing? It's much more likely that you're going and before very complex sentences or abstract ideas. So maybe break those sentences down, make them less complex. Or if you're reaching for vocabulary, if that's what you find is that when you're trying to think of a word, that tends to be where you and then maybe it's okay to come up with simpler ways to say it so you and less. Or think about words that you might want to use before you have that interview so that they're much easier to access than if you haven't been familiar with them. Also, check what discourse markers you tend to lean on. So are there certain preferences in the ones that you use, and where do you use them? For example, are they in the middle of a sentence or are they at the beginning? Because we find that they impact perceptions much more strongly when they're interrupting what you're saying than when they occur at the beginning or the end. So once you know your pattern, it is easier to adjust your style. So then what do you do with it once you know your pattern? Well, this is where you practice, right? So this is where you actually have that mock interview, or you get some questions, and you can either have a friend help prep you, or you can just record yourself. And this is where you're going to pay attention to your style and use the insight that you learned from your self-analysis to try to phrase things in ways that you won't use some of these markers. So for example, if you use a lot of hedges, try to rephrase so that you don't use them when you're not really uncertain. Then you can also try to limit ums and uhs, because the more practiced you are, the more recall will not be difficult, and therefore you won't tend to and before them. And finally, make sure that you're using discourse markers at the beginning of sentences rather than in between them, and not ones that are not very conventional. So I'm going to stop there and take questions because I want to make sure we have some time, but hopefully this has been helpful, and I'm happy to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Valerie. This has been incredibly interesting, and we've got a lot of great questions. So I will just dive right in. We had a couple of people ask, so I'm going to combine them, about the effect of tone of voice and facial expressions or gestures, and how those interact with or impact the effect of these different linguistic markers you've discussed.
Well, of course, that's a little different depending on what your gender. As we've seen with a lot of these features, we have different rules, and that's actually something to be aware of once you get that job and you're in a boardroom setting or in meetings, and you see how power is differentially distributed. A lot of that has to do with how these features vary based on gender, and also how tone of voice or voice pitch is used. So the research on voice pitch is actually quite interesting and probably not that surprising. Almost every study that's looked at how voice pitch correlates with authority and power finds that lower voice pitch is more authoritarian, authoritative, is more confident, or at least how it's construed. That doesn't actually mean it's more confident, and more certain. We also find in studies that look at groups that are doing a shared task, when you start the task and you assign the project to the group with no external status or expertise assigned, so it's sort of a free-form group, those that start to be the leaders very quickly start to adopt a lower voice pitch, and those that tend to be more subordinate or sort of followers adopt a higher voice pitch from where they started. So pitch seems to have a very strong correlation with perceptions of expertise, authority, confidence, and intelligence. And therefore, when you are in an interview, you obviously want to work at the lower pitch range so that you come across as more confident and competent. Now, obviously, you want to do this naturally, but it does seem that lower voice pitch is construed in professional settings to be much better. Then the problem for women here is that lower voice pitch affects their ratings on dynamism and attractiveness scales, whereas low pitch for men is both good in a professional setting and positive on scales of attractiveness. So a lot of times we see that women have what's called creaky voice or vocal fry, and we think that's because that operates at lower pitch ranges, and it's a way for women to incorporate a lower voice pitch in a professional setting without giving up the benefits of having a higher voice pitch when they walk in. So overall, in terms of pitch, lower is better as long as it's natural.
Thank you.
Was there any more of that question that I have forgotten to answer?
No, I think that was a great overview. And that actually leads to another question that we're getting a lot of questions. A few people have asked about how to handle cultural differences, or if English is not your first language, how that might affect your approach to analyzing your language and improving it.
Yes, well, that's a whole different set of issues. So a lot of these features actually are very culturally dependent, and so many speakers come from cultures that are much more politeness oriented than English. English is actually not it's a polite language, but we don't have formalized politeness routines, which languages like Japanese do. So hedges, for example, would be something that if you are a speaker of Japanese, you're probably more likely to use more of them in English. So one thing to be aware of is the type of culture. If you have a lot of politeness routines in your culture, then chances are you're going to adopt more of these powerless speech features because they're really tuned into face, to making sure you're maintaining your own face and that of others. And you might want to be aware when you're practicing that that's going to be part of your linguistic style. Of course, what most people want to know when they are cross-cultural job interviewees is how their accent is going to affect how they're perceived. And I would say that that is probably one of the biggest problems that is faced by people that are interviewing for jobs in a language other than their own. There's not a lot of quick and easy solutions for that, except when you're practicing. What you should probably do is get someone who is a speaker of that language to help you analyze where it is that you're most difficult to understand. And there's, again, no way to say, well, these are the sounds that often get us most into trouble, because languages differ in their phonological inventory. But I will say that two of the worst ones, especially for those coming from Asian languages, tend to be L's and R's. And often for other languages, sounds like V are quite difficult. And so if you have some sense of where it is that you're having problems in being understood, then you can work with that native English speaker to perhaps try to figure out how to position your tongue. A lot of times it has to do with tongue position to make you a little clearer. An alternative, if you have the resources for this, is to work with a speech therapist that works with accent reduction. And most speech therapy companies do this, and they can help identify for your specific language what sounds are most problematic and help you learn to move your mouth in positions that will make those sounds a little clearer.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We've had a couple of questions about how to balance coming across as confident without crossing into arrogance. And especially for men who may be in a very high position, they're asking how to make sure they don't come across as arrogant without downplaying their experience.
Right. Well, this, of course, is the tricky one, because as we've seen, relative status is extremely important. And even if you're an expert, which is often the case where we come into a job interview at a senior management level, we are actually expert. We have a lot of experience, but especially for men who tend to use a more powerful speech style in general because of their societal position of power that has sort of indoctrinated and habituated those kinds of resources for them. Especially if you're interviewing with a lot of experience, you might easily come across as arrogant. And so for you might actually find that you're not using enough of the features that soften the force of what you have to say. So this is where using a few hedges, using more discourse markers, and some intensifiers might actually make you come across as more likable and appropriately deferential, because I think that's really the trick, is we don't want to come across as arrogant. And this is certainly true of men more than women, because women's speech generally has more of these patterns that are construed as uncertain and less confident. And that, of course, is a negative for women on the flip side in positions of power. But for men, I think listening to yourself talk, so if you do what I suggest of having a self-analysis and consider what you're saying that's incredibly unmitigated and bald. So when you talk to other people, are you using more directive speech? Do you use things like I think and maybe? And also pronoun use. Pronoun use is a really key factor in ideas of collectiveness versus individuality. If you use a lot of I, that actually can make you be construed negatively as very self-involved and only introspective. So consider using let's and we more, which seems to make you more of a team builder. So even something as simple as switching up your pronouns can make a difference in how you're construed as being a team player versus being all in it for yourself.
It makes a lot of sense. And we're getting a few people asking about the flip side. How can women make sure that they come across as confident and assured and not bossy?
Right. So this, of course, is an eternal question for women, and it's a bit more complex than I can go into in a few minutes. But here's the short form answer for that. It's a two-way street here. Women have both the need to be perceived as appropriately deferential and also appropriately powerful, but the rules are different than those for men who have the same pressures in a workplace setting. We have historically been assumed to be in a one down position. So that has actually shaped our speech so that we tend to have to use more indirect types of speech to get the same work done. Now, that doesn't mean it's any less effective. In fact, it often is more effective. But that just means that the way that we phrase it, the way that we construct it, tends to draw from more of these features that are seen as powerless language features. So the expectation for women in those contexts is they will use more of those powerless features. But unfortunately, what we find is this often makes them be overlooked as either being too meek or uncertain or not sure enough of what they want to do, that they don't speak up and they're not heard well. And when they do speak up, because they use a lot of hedges, the idea is if they're picked up by another person, and often a man later, who says them more forcefully, if you interview people after that meeting's over, they'll say, oh, Bob came up with that idea, not Sally, because of the fact that she phrased it with a hedge. So I think, again, practice makes perfect here. You have to make sure you're using enough so that you're not construed as overly aggressive. And of course, this is a double bind for women. But also make sure that you are heard in the important places. So again, the same advice I would give you when you record yourself. Really notice your patterns and be careful of hedges. I think while we expect women to use them more, that doesn't mean that it actually makes them seem like stronger, more assertive speakers. So where you're hedging should really be only where you're expressing uncertainty, and not where you're trying to get across an idea and just be softer about it. Because a lot of times what we find is that causes people not to remember that you came up with the idea in the first place.
Very practical advice. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Okay.
So one that is coming up a lot is people are asking about the speed at which they speak. And some people are saying when they're enthusiastic or excited, they tend to speak much faster. And what impression does this make? How important is this to pay attention to?
Right. Well, certainly there is some research on speed of speech. It's complicated a little bit by the fact that how the rate of talking will be determined somewhat by factors like what region you grew up in or what nationality you are. So all of those things have different rules on how fast or slow you talk. So for example, we have that image of the slow Southern talker. And in fact, when you look at comparisons across regions, you find that it is true that Southern speech tends to be at a slightly slower speech rate. It's not highly different, and it also tends to not be as different in urban areas. But Southerners do speak at a slower rate than Northerners and Westerners. And in fact, it appears that Westerners speak faster than Northerners or Southerners. So even Northerners might need to be worried when they're competing against people from other areas, because faster speech rates are actually generally construed more favorably. It seems to give off the impression that you're a quicker thinker. Now, this is not true, obviously, because speech rate is something that is very much tied to how you grew up and just the routinized kind of speech rate that was typical for your background and your region and your language. But in general, speaking faster is less detrimental than speaking slower. And so the takeaway there is if you speak faster, as long as you're easy to understand, it probably isn't a deficit.
That's good to know. And we've had a very interesting question as well about once you're on the team, you're in a new place, in a new workplace, how do you identify and adjust to the linguistic style of your new environment?
Right. Well, of course, this is all getting the job. And once you're there, what do you do? And there are a lot of different things that you need to keep in mind. One is if you are in a senior management position, you also have a responsibility to try to set the stage so that it's a linguistically fair workplace. And one of the things that you might get a sense as a new employee is judging how linguistically fair that workplace is. So one thing is to observe how the others speak. And now you can use the tools knowing these different features, of looking at the way that people interact in meetings to see what kind of linguistic style is most rewarded. So it's hard to give a one size fits all answer to this, because the corporate culture at different kinds of institutions will be very different. At a young startup, for example, where it's a much more youthful corporate culture, there's probably going to be a very different style that's rewarded or allowed, a much more casual style. You'll probably find some more colloquial speech use, a lot more intensifiers, because these are actually much more frequent in younger speech than you might find in a more conservative, say, law firm or private equity firm. So you're going to need to do an analysis at a meeting or where you can see other people interact, similar to the type of self-analysis you did, where you look at the type of speech style that seems to be rewarded. One of the things to think about is who is talking the most and whose ideas are being picked up the most. And a lot of times it has less to do with who those people are and their great ideas, and more to do with how they were delivered. And this is, of course, where in a senior management position, if you have the opportunity to make a more level playing ground, you should be aware of how speech style might be interacting with who you listen to and what you think they say. And so the best answer to that would be to take a couple of weeks to get used to the kind of style that seems to be prevalent, and then mirror that style, or if you have the authority, change it to make sure that it's a more level playing field.
A very important message as well. Let's take one more question. That works
Sure.
for you?
Sure.
All right. So we have actually had a few people ask very specific questions. Referring to some of the hedges and the speech patterns they use, we've had people ask, what do you think about, does that make sense to you? And interesting as fillers or discourse markers.
To say, what do you, I'm sorry, can you, I didn't quite get that question.
Sure, in place of or if you use,
oh, I see, to use, all right, instead
of, saying, does that make sense, to kind of check in with your listener? What is the effect of these phrases?
Well, I think, does that make sense, actually is probably not, there's not actually a lot of studies on that specific phrase, but I would say that in a job interview context, unless you're talking about something highly complex, asking someone does that make sense implies that you might have said it in a way that didn't. So I would probably try to steer away from that. So one way that people say something as a listenership check is as a at the end. And that's less problematic than putting it in the middle. But you could also say, something. So I'm constructing this concept for our operations overseas, and I was hoping to do X. What do you think about that? That's fine. And I think that was one of the other options, because asking someone for their thoughts is a good way, actually, to both engage them in collaborative discussion building and also not sound like you're doubting yourself. It's more open to the interests of others, which then displays you as a good team builder. And I think that's also the flip side of making sure you have a lot of authority. You also want to make sure you can be construed as having a lot of ability to work with others. So I think in that case, instead of saying, does that make sense, which I think implies somehow you might have said something that didn't, you would want to say, what do you think about that? And that would actually then put it in their lap, give you some insight into their thoughts so that you can construct your answer, and also check for collaborative or show some of your team building ability.
Thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions. Do you have any resources that you would share with our attendees? People have asked about accent improvement or books that might help them.
Right.
And a reminder, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar.
Certainly, yes. Well, in terms of accent reduction or help with speech if you are a non-native speaker, usually the best source of that is to find a speech therapist that works with accent reduction. And a lot of times we think of speech therapists as helping with disordered speech, but actually they have a wide range of things that they work with. Linguists like myself are theoretical, so most of the time we don't actually work with clients in the same way. So while I'm in the research side of things, I'm not in the applied side of things. So you probably wouldn't do that well by going to a linguist. What you really want to do is go to someone that specifically has worked in applied context and practical context with speakers that need accent reduction. To find one, you could ask around if people know speech therapists that they've worked with, or you can actually just search up a speech therapist in your area and go to the website and see if they offer accent reduction therapy, which is what it would be called. And quite often you'll find that they do. We just don't realize that they do that in addition. So that's probably the best resource for that. In terms of speech, there are some books written on language in the workplace that might help. And Deborah Tannen, for example, has one out that I think is about 10 years old that has, I can't remember the exact title, and I can send it to you so you could send it out. But if you just look up Deborah Tannen, she's written a number of books, and it's very clear that it's workplace oriented. So that's probably the best source just to kind of look over some of the advice that people can give you. If you're more interested in just language and language and society interaction, then I have some resources you can look at. You can obviously if you look me up, you can find my research website that will tell you about the types of research I do and what we've found. And so I can send that link out to you as well. I didn't put it on the slide. I also have a blog for Psychology Today that talks about some of these different aspects. And I actually do talk about, for example, being a woman in the workplace in a couple of those blogs, and a variety of different topics that might be relevant. And I'm going to put up a series of those in the next few months that deal with specifically how to make good first impressions linguistically. Or I have a language and society course that has a couple sections that are more occupation oriented and gender oriented. And then, of course, I will put some things about how our language affects perceptions. That's pretty much what that book I'm working on. So I can also just keep everybody apprised of when that comes out. But in general, I would suggest if you're looking for hands-on practical help with your speech, that you go to a speech therapist.
Great, thank you. And we had a tip from the audience that the book is called Talking 9 to 5.
Talking 9 to 5. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good book to start with if you're looking for workplace advice.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time today, but thank you so much for this incredible presentation. And I know I used an intensifier. And thank you to everybody who attended for your wonderful questions and your engagement. And we'll send out the recording soon. And we hope you all have a great day.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right.